Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Minnesota DNR episode 100 and, well, I think it's 98? 198 episodes we've been going. Might be 199. And today we're going to talk about the American chestnut with David Stein. David's a fellow DNR employee and very passionate about the American chestnut. So, David, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the group, and you can go right into your presentation from there.
Perfect. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
My name is David Stein. I am the program coordinator of the Conservation Partners Legacy Grants Program. And I'm also an enthusiast of the American chestnut. How I got involved in American chestnuts, as the CPL coordinator, I have to go out to project sites to see how restorations and enhancements are going. And on one of my sites, I was surprised to see a reproducing stand of American chestnut. I learned about them previously in all of my forestry and ecology classes, kind of a sort of mythical species, as much as you can get. And seeing one was very exciting. So my next questions were, how did they get here? Who planted them? And where else are they? So as you can see in the background of this slide, we have a couple of fruiting American chestnuts bordering a prairie on DNR land, which in itself is just a great sight to see. So I have a couple disclaimers before starting this presentation. This is a renewed area of study. So this is an area of study where we're really still finding new records and new historical data. So this is just the data that we have now. This could be subject to change either in years' time or in months' time, or it could change by the end of this program today. We're still finding new records and new historic data. And usually your area foresters, either if they're DNR or if they're employed by the county or your city, they're going to have more up-to-date data because they know the trees in their backyard. On top of this, the American chestnut is a sensitive species. They are very susceptible to disease. So for this program, we're not going to be revealing any tree locations just to make sure that the spread of that disease stays minimal. The only exceptions of this are publicly accessible records that are really easy to find online. So we'll go ahead and get started just with an overview of the American chestnut. The scientific name of this plant is Castanea dentata. It's a member of the oak family along with beeches, that's family Fagaceae. They are native to eastern North America. The range does not include Minnesota, but they have been here for at least 150 years. But their former range ranged from all the way up north into southern Maine to down south into northern Florida. So they have adapted and evolved along a very large range of climates. So they are well suited to harsh winters and hot summers and humid and dry conditions. They are really kind of a widespread species and are pretty adaptable. This was once one of the most common trees in eastern North America. It's estimated that about one every four species, or one of every four trees that were in the Appalachian area were American chestnuts. And it was also called the redwood of the East just based on their size and their wood production. So some historical photos that we have of the American chestnut really shows how they compare to just your everyday person. These were from the U.S. Forest Service. You can just see how much these trees towered over people. And based on their size and their availability, they were really sought after in the lumber industry. These were also called America's perfect tree. They are fast growing, they are long lived. The wood that they provide is lightweight and durable, but also rot resistant and easy to work with. They also produce nuts at a really, really high rate. So they have a very reliable nut production. Every year they're producing a high amount of mast as compared to our years on, years off of our normal masting native trees. Couple of extra things about the American chestnut's ecology. They do favor acidic soils. They prefer sandy soils, but as long as they're well drained and acidic, they are able to thrive in them. They like woodland edges. Eventually woods will grow around them, but when you're planting them, they really like that edge habitat where they're getting full or partial sun. For fire tolerance, they're actually pretty fire tolerant. When they're saplings and fire rolls through, they will rebound pretty easily. They are able to shoot up a lot more stems, which is beneficial to them in other regards, which we'll get to later. But they are able to withstand fire due to it being a presence in their former habitat. And today we see moderate fire tolerance in adulthood, very similar to our red oak species. On top of this, they are eaten by deer pretty aggressively. Deer really like the taste of young chestnuts. It's kind of like their ice cream and cake and brownies and cookies all rolled into one species, so they will seek them out and really eat them as much as they can. So again, they've adapted to that deer herbivory, and again, will shoot up a lot more sprouts as they are snipped back. On the right-hand side, these are some of our trees in the Minnesota chestnut population. We've got adult trees, we've got trees that do produce seed, and then we have naturally occurring seedlings, which are carried by our friendly squirrels when they forget them and they do sprout up. A little bit more about their we can go ahead and see that they are high in carbohydrates. The nuts are, at least. They are technically self-fertile, but pollination is often often needed from multiple trees. So when you have a tree by itself, it will really take its time not producing those fertile trees. But when it has a friend nearby, it can share that genetic way of doing things. It can go and produce those nuts. They also produce a high amount of seed per square meter. So American chestnuts, compared to our other native oaks like black oaks, northern red oaks, and white oaks, they blow those oaks right out of the water. In a square meter, the American chestnut can produce 69,000 seeds on average, while our other oak species only get up to about a couple thousand, and that's really depending on the masting year too. The American chestnut is very reliable in producing those seeds. And the nuts are eaten by a large variety of wildlife. So these can include things like game species like turkeys, bear, deer, squirrels, and grouse. And the passenger pigeon, the extinct species, also had a large variety of its diet made up of American chestnut. There's some that think that the American chestnut's decline led to the passenger pigeon's decline, but that's just a hypothesis, and the timelines don't really match up. But the chestnut was threatened by different species before chestnut blight made it through, as well as deforestation. So that probably did take a big toll. Chestnuts do have a wide variety of insect interactions too. So they have at least 66 species of pollinators. 43 of those are native to Minnesota. So as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, those are just some of our native pollinators that will go ahead and use American chestnut flowers for either nectar or pollen. These include things like flies, bees, wasps, butterflies, moths, and beetles, a large variety of pollinating insects. And on top of that, for butterflies and moths, about 125 species of caterpillars will go ahead and feed on the leaves and use those to get to maturity. How we identify the American chestnut, they do have pretty easily definable leaves and other characteristics. So with their leaves, they are very long. They're always longer than they are wide, and they have those serrated teeth on their edges, which gives them the name Castanea dentata, or the toothed leaf Castanea. The base of the leaf is also sharply angled, going towards the petiole or the stem. And again, the really big defining characteristic is that they are long and they are serrated. We have some lookalikes here in Minnesota. These include the black walnut. The way to differentiate these are compound leaves, multiple leaves on one main petiole or stem, as compared to the American chestnut, which is a simple leaf. And then the chinkapin oak, which is in southern Minnesota, they do have those toothed edges, but they aren't as long, and they look, again, more like an oak leaf than they are going to look like a chestnut leaf. We've got ways to identify the seeds as well. The seeds are, again, variable in size and shape. They can be flat, they can be round, depending on how they form in their fruit or their burr. But again, these are most likely going to be flatter and smaller than commercial chestnuts. They're also a lot hairier than a commercial chestnuts. And if you take a look at the seed pods, they have much longer spines than our commercial chestnuts, up to about 3 centimeters in length, which is a pretty long spine. We don't have too many lookalikes for seeds. Again, the American chestnut's there in the center. The commercial chestnut is probably the most similar looking, but they are really differentiated by their size. You can compare the size of the seeds between where they stand in different hands. Again, the commercial chestnut's much larger than the American. Then we also have the Ohio buckeye, or also known as the horse chestnut, which looks kind of similar. They're a lot lumpier and they don't have that point at the end of the seed. They don't have those hairs. But that's really where the similarities end in just general overall look. The Ohio buckeye or the horse chestnut is not closely related to the American chestnut. It's in the soapberry family rather than in the oak family. The bark, again, is also pretty easy to differentiate. At immaturity, the bark is going to be pretty rough with very deep grooves and large flat-topped ridges. The only thing that kind of comes close to that are going to be our oak species, again, the red oaks, which are fairly similar in terms of bark. But when we get to the northern red oak, those grooves are very large, but the ridges aren't. And we get to the pin oak, the ridges are very large, but the grooves aren't. So with the American chestnut, it has to have those deep grooves and those large ridges. So this is where we get to the sadder part of our presentation, the decline of the American chestnut. So as we stated before, this tree is great. It produces a lot of nuts. It has a lot of lumber. Why aren't we seeing it more often? This is where the decline comes into play. In the early 20th century, around 1904, a disease known as chestnut blight was introduced into the United States out of infected trees from Japan. They first landed in the Bronx in New York. That's where it was first identified. And over the next several decades, the trees were very, very highly impacted. It's estimated that about 3 to 4 billion trees were killed. This is due to a wide variety of things, mainly the disease, but also forestry practices where foresters would try to get ahead of the blight, kill a lot of trees to develop a sort of buffer between alive trees and infected trees. Overall, this didn't work. Again, we also had economic factors in that part of the early 20th century. We had the Great Depression, we had 2 world wars, and the resources available to protect the species just weren't there. So for the chestnut blight, the disease will only affect the stems of the tree, but not the roots. And we'll talk a little bit about how that affects the trees later on. But as chestnut blight moved through the entire range of the tree, they were declared what's known as functionally extinct. They are still alive, but they don't have the same impact in the ecosystem as they once did. So they're not providing that shelter or that food or that habitat that they once did. They're more just a small, tiny part of that ecosystem that doesn't really provide too many benefits and doesn't provide any function on that overall ecosystem. However, we do have surviving trees outside of the species range, which still do show some large growth patterns and seed production, and some of those can be found in Minnesota. Something interesting that we can see is during the time that the chestnuts were being taken over by chestnut blight, there were pretty sensationalized headlines, but for good reason. They were overall destroyed in their former range. The chestnut blight, we're going to go through that just a little bit. They are what's known as a fatal fungal disease. So it is fatal to the tree. When it gets infected, that tree is going to die. It's what's known as a canker disease. It's what's will create what's known as a canker or an open sore on the stem. That sore will cut off nutrient flow from the roots moving up to the stem and the leaves and the fruit. And as that infection matures, that nutrient flow is cut off even more. The roots, on the other hand, are not affected by this disease. The chestnut blight can't live underground. It can't survive. So what we'll see is those adaptations that the chestnut originally had to combat fire and herbivory, shooting up a lot more sprouts to combat the removal of its original stems,
It will benefit it in the short term. As the chestnut blight moves through, it will kill off the stems, the roots release more. It will then get affected again, the stems will die back, and it will shoot up more sprouts. And overall, it will do that for years until the tree naturally will die due to lack of nutrients. The chestnut blight, again, spreads via wind and wildlife based on spores, like any other fungal disease does. It has these orange fruiting bodies on the stem that will release those spores. Spores are carried by a wide variety of means, either wind or animals or people, and they will need to find a fresh wound on a tree that it can go ahead and seep into. These can be caused by fire or caused by animals scratching against it, woodpeckers feeding, and it can even be caused by seasonal leaf and fruit fall. So when a leaf or a fruit falls off, that creates an open spot that the chestnut blight can go into. And it's not just existing on our chestnuts, it also has other non-chestnut hosts. And most notably here, the white oak, it very much prefers the white oak out of things that aren't chestnuts. It's able to survive there. And that's the way that it can reach areas that don't necessarily have chestnuts in them by using oak as its host. Other smaller hosts that don't pop up too much are things like red maple, shagbark hickory, and staghorn sumac. For chestnut blight, there are a couple solutions that you can use to deal with it in both the short term and the long term. Temporary solutions are mainly those found on sort of a tree by tree basis, and those are successful on a tree by tree basis. We have things like mud packing, which is where researchers realized, hey, chestnut blight can't exist underground. It can't exist in the soil. So why don't we bring the soil to the chestnut blight? So what's done here is where soil is wet to a mud consistency, plastered on top of the tree, on top of a canker, wrapped in plastic and left there for a full growing season. That will eventually heal the canker, but the chestnut blight will still exist in the tree, and you have to do it on a case-by-case basis where more cankers open up. Something else that exists is called hypovirulence. This is a strain of chestnut blight that's infected by a virus known as a hypovirus that weakens the blight, and it's able to have our trees survive a little bit longer than they would in a fully non-infected chestnut blight situation. And we also have fungicides, which are able to hold off chestnut blight for a couple of years or a couple of seasons, and able to prevent spread, but you have to keep retreating it. Some more permanent solutions to chestnut blight would be things like selective breeding. So finding trees that are more resistant out on the landscape and breeding them selectively. Hybridization, American chestnut is able to hybridize with Chinese chestnut, with other Asian species to give it a little bit more of a resistance. And other organizations are trying to breed first-generation hybrids back with American chestnuts to keep more American genetics while retaining the Asian resistance to chestnut blight. And we also have genetic modification, where other researchers are introducing genes from other species directly into the chestnut genome to help them be more adaptable in the long term. We're now going to move on to the history of the chestnut blight population. This is how they got to Minnesota. It was through 3 waves of introduction. The first wave was starting in 1870, so about 150 years ago. These were first plantings by Eastern settlers from northern New York. The second wave of chestnut planting was pre-blight planting in Minnesota before the blight got here for research, wildlife, habitat, and conservation. This ranged from 1940 to 1986. In 1986, chestnut blight was first observed in Minnesota. And finally, we have that post-blight planting. So introduction efforts, again, for research and trial, seeing how they do in Minnesota before the chestnut blight completely overruns the state. And these mainly come from seeds sourced in Virginia at the American Chestnut Foundation. So our first plantings, again, started in the 1870s. These were from Eastern settlers, mainly from New York and the northern part of that chestnut range. Known examples of those old trees were mainly focused in the southern part of the state. These would be street trees in the city of Elgin, different farms in Caledonia and Cannon Falls. We had a couple examples in West St. Paul. And then the most important ones of these old trees that we'll discuss today would be things planted near Doubles Farm in Viola, and then hedgerows in Rochester. The Doubles Farm in Viola is a positive example, while the hedgerows in Rochester are a more negative example. And we'll talk about those in a little bit as we get to them. So pre-blight planting started in 1940. These were chestnuts that were planted by either interested landowners, conservationists, and researchers to keep specimens outside of their current range where the blight is, as well as other interested nonprofits and other interested landowners, just to keep a relic of what used to be on the landscape on their actual lands. So some examples of these would be trees planted at the University of Minnesota, either at their Southern Research and Outreach Station in Waseca. I still believe there are some living examples of those there. The University of Minnesota's Landscape Arboretum in Chanhassen has a couple examples. They are currently infected with blight, so you're not getting the full growth of those trees, but you can see what they do look like when they are infected. We have the Hormel Arboretum, now the Hormel Nature Center. Those trees were planted back in this time frame, but have been since removed. Carleton College Arboretum also had a couple of examples that were removed. And then we have the most notable examples in private landowners. So the city of Minneapolis has a heritage tree program. And on the right-hand side of the screen, this is their heritage American chestnut that a private landowner planted in their front yard. This is their typical growth pattern in a city setting. Again, looks very similar to oak in their city settings, just with the exception that in this one, it's the spring and it is in full bloom. We also had private landowners keep records of where they planted. So this comes from the diary of William Frame in Northfield, Minnesota. He states that in the spring of 1962, he planted some American chestnuts from the trees growing on the farm of Vern Doubles. That's that old example, originally planted in the 1870s at Viola, Minnesota. His grandfather planted the chestnuts when they first settled there, bringing the seed from New York State. So that's how we know where they came from. And our trees have since been bearing increasing amounts of nuts since 1972. So those nuts have been used for planting additional trees, cooking, so on and so forth. But they have been involved in the landscape since 1972, having other wildlife eat those seeds and possibly carry them off to elsewhere in the state. Our largest planting effort with American chestnuts back in this time frame was the Richard Dorer plantings. So this was a complete reforestation of southeast Minnesota blufflands. Richard Dorer was from Appalachia originally, and he noted that the blufflands down in the driftless region were similar habitat to the Appalachian Mountains. And being from there, he would be very familiar with the American chestnut. So that was most likely what prompted him to start planting them here in the southeastern part of the state. So we get some clues on where he planted these from Prospects of American Chestnut Plantings in Minnesota, which was a University of Minnesota agricultural experimentation publication. They say that Richard Dorer made these Whitewater River Valley and possibly other plantings in various river and creek valleys when he was employed by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Mr. Dorer was largely responsible for the creation of the Memorial Hardwood Forest, and his intent in nut trees prompted him to plant trees of several species throughout the southern portion of this forest. And the DNR knows where a lot of these trees still are present. There's an old forestry nursery site that they are located at, and they're also spread around that area of the state. We don't, however, know what the total population of what Richard Dorer planted was. More trees are waiting to be rediscovered, and on top of this, more trees probably were sprouting up since they were introduced. Again, based on the amount of seeds that they produce, and again, herbivory of squirrels and other rodents carrying them off and planting them. We'll now get to chestnut blight. In Minnesota, this was first reported again in 1986 on those old trees in Rochester, that hedgerow that we talked about earlier. It's currently present in parts of southeast Minnesota. It's also in Carver County at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, and in Ramsey County on some street trees. So it's very widespread in Minnesota, but it is also limited to those certain pockets. We're seeing that our isolated populations are faring a lot better than eastern states. Again, they are very isolated. We have a stand here, we have a stand a couple miles away, we have a stand even further away than that. It's kind of a polka dot pattern all throughout the landscape in Minnesota. So it gives space between those stands where chestnut blight just takes a lot more effort to infect. For example, we have infected and not infected stands of trees just down the road from each other within 3 miles. The infected stands, on the picture on the right, you can see what an infected tree looks like with the main stem dieback. This is located just 3 miles away from a large old stand of trees that's still producing nuts and shows no sign of infection. This has led to certain people thinking that it could be cold weather benefits. The chestnut blight is not well adapted to Minnesota winters, and Minnesota winters can get very harsh. So that's just one thing that is assisting our chestnuts. Again, that distance also really helps them, giving them more of an isolated quality. And then finally, we're getting to modern planting efforts. So this ranges from 1986 to the present. So they've taken a wide variety of forms. The most abundant of these is protection of our existing populations. Again, we're seeing populations present in our scientific and natural areas, or SNAs, in our wildlife management areas, or WMAs, and even in our state forests. So we have a large variety of chestnuts spread all throughout the state. On the right-hand side here, we can see a healthy stand of, again, reproducing American chestnuts on a scientific and natural area. We also have a good example in cities. So the city of Red Wing operates a conservation area called Billings-Tomfor Conservation Area, and they have a very healthy stand of about 5 trees that, again, are still producing nuts. Again, since they are so isolated, they have not seen any pressure from American chestnut blight, or from chestnut blight, since they have been planted several years ago. And we also have active planting and research. The best example that I can think of right now is the city of Minneapolis. They have a lot of American chestnuts that they've planted throughout their park system, and they're working with the University of Minnesota to keep eyes on what's going on here. And then we also have the Minnesota DNR. We know of where American chestnuts are. We're keeping an eye on them, and we are keeping tabs of what they're doing and if they're getting infected and what that infection looks like. So this brings us to the current status of American chestnut in Minnesota, where we are right now and what it looks like. So on the map to the right here, you can see where they exist here in Minnesota on a county-wide basis. In the green is their current range, in the red is where they formerly were, and those small germ signs are where chestnut blight currently is on the landscape. So American chestnuts can be found all across eastern Minnesota, just in isolated pockets. There's not a large stand of them here and there. They're here just dotting the landscape. Chestnut blight is present in Minnesota, but it has not infected all of our trees. And many trees have escaped infection, again, due to their relative isolation. Having distance between each stand really gives them the edge in escaping that disease. And currently, we're thinking that the population here in Minnesota is just over 1,000, with most of those trees being wild growing. So our next step is how to recover the chestnut. Again, we have a really good opportunity here in Minnesota, since we are outside of the blight range, or outside of their original native range. We do have blight, but we do have some ways to combat that we're seeing right now. So what can we do? So the province of Ontario in Canada laid out this really good 4-step recovery strategy that can be applied to a lot of places. This is a really good gold standard of what protection and recovery of the American chestnut could be in the long term. So there are, again, 4 steps. The first one is surveying suitable populations or suitable habitat for American chestnuts and protecting and monitoring those known populations. The second is promoting the public awareness of American chestnut, which is what we're doing right now during these webinars and fact-finding exercises. 3 is evaluating the management measures to control threats to the American chestnut, whether that's logging, whether that's animal damage, human interference, or chestnut blight. And finally, securing sources of seeds originating from blight-free trees to get us the next generation and keep this planting effort and keep this population alive. When we get to Minnesota, there are a couple of recovery strategies that we're seeing work pretty well or have the opportunity to work pretty well. Keith Gilland is a researcher on chestnut over at University of Wisconsin in Stout, and he gave a previous discussion on the Minnesota American chestnuts and what opportunities exist. What he recommends is aggregate mining. So we have a lot of old abandoned aggregate mines that formerly mined sand and gravel and other aggregate stones. And these were pretty similar to the mining sites that they saw out in West Virginia. You see the same level of disturbance, you see the similar sort of low quality soil in these former mining sites, but American chestnuts thrive there. On these old coal mines, they have shown very resilient growth and very vigorous growth. And in partnership with the American Chestnut Foundation, they've been seeing some good results. So this could be a possible way for Minnesota to join in getting chestnuts on the landscape, where other things might not be as successful. Lake Grubowski, which is a researcher over at the American Chestnut Foundation, he recommends that we do something known as distance planting. So getting as far away from the blight as possible, taking our isolated stands and taking it to the next level, planting them 50, 60, 80, 100 miles away from where we're seeing some chestnut blight infection. That way we'll get more distance, and again, it allows these trees to thrive without any of that disease pressure. Isolated stand planting, we can continue this process. It's currently in practice. This is what we're seeing on the landscape right now, and we're seeing some pretty good results. Again, there are stands that are infected and non-infected very close together. How long that will last, we don't know, but if it's lasted this long since they started in the 40s, who knows how long they could last. And finally, there's an opportunity to do hand pollination between these distance and isolated plant standings. So we can take pollen from a tree that's growing up near Cloquet and move it down to trees near Redwing or Rochester, and vice versa. We can take pollen and flowers from non-infected trees and start moving them around just to get us some genetic diversity. Ideally, what we'll want to do, if we do want to do recovery strategies in the state of Minnesota, is all of the above. Everything that we can possibly do to protect the species and keep them on the landscape and keep them healthy for the longest period of time is worth doing. But the biggest question is, why should we care? Again, chestnuts are not native to Minnesota. They have been here for 150 years, yes. They do grow successfully here without a lot of blight pressure, yes. But at the end of the day, they're not native. So why should we care? And for this, we have a couple of different reasons. The biggest reason that's getting a lot of traction right now is actually climate resilience. Again, these are a very fast-growing tree. They're a very long-lived tree, and they're a very large tree when they get to maturity. That being said, they can store a lot of carbon. On top of this, when the tree does eventually fall over or die, those pieces of lumber are very rot resistant. So it's keeping that carbon set and ready to go, not in the atmosphere, just located in this wood for a long period of time. On top of this, again, they have evolved along a large range of climates ranging from Florida to Maine, so they're able to exist in a fluctuating climate scenario. The ecology, again, chestnuts provide a large variety of food and shelter to a lot of wildlife. They produce a large variety of seeds reliably every year, and those seeds can support some of our native wildlife where other trees might be struggling. We're seeing a lot of impacts with things like oak wilt and other plant diseases. The American chestnut has its own disease problems, but they do produce a lot of food where other trees might be struggling. Species preservation. We have trees here on the landscape that produce seeds. Those seeds can be transferred over to the next generation. And as we plant more and more of these seeds, we're trying to find more and more examples of blight resistance. So if we keep producing these seeds and keep planting, that gives us more of a chance to find mutations in a plant that might give it more blight resistance, or able to stave off the blight for a little bit longer so it can start producing seeds before it dies. And finally, the most exciting one is food history. You can taste what previous generations of Americans ate, stretching all the way back to prehistoric times. Chestnut blight has been a large component in indigenous food cultures when they were on the landscape, and has been used in contemporary America previously before blight did its damage. They were a pretty good staple of American food culture. They were readily available, they were produced in abundance, and they were delicious. So having them on the landscape gives you an opportunity to try what previous Americans did eat. So now we're going to see the next logical step, how to get involved. So the biggest thing that you can do if you know of chestnuts, or if you find a chestnut on the landscape, is to give us a heads up. You can always send me an email with pictures and coordinates. My email is right there. You can also find it on the Conservation Partners Legacy Grants website. And you can also upload your sightings to iNaturalist. This gives the wider conservation community an idea of where these nuts are, and allows more of a conversation in the future for getting them protected and knowing what research is next to go. You can also collect some seeds. You can use the seeds for either planting. You can plant a tree in your yard or your neighbor's yard or a friend's yard, and you can cook with the seeds. You can try what they taste like. And finally, you can spread the word. You can talk to others about this amazing tree. You can give the story of how they were once abundant throughout the United States, how they quickly declined, and how we are trying to preserve them in the here and now. So moving forward, what I would recommend is getting out there and trying your hand at collecting some seeds. Just know that you will need to follow all rules, regulations, and laws when you are looking for American chestnuts. You will need to see where rules exist for WMAs, for SNAs, for straight forests, for federal lands. You'll need to know what the foraging and taking of species legally is where you're going to go. Know that some places you just can't do it, and that's okay. But some places do encourage foraging and do encourage taking of these seeds for use by the general public. Knowing when to collect is also important. The nuts will ripen at different times depending on where you are. At lower latitudes, the ripening is following a hot period of time. That's going to be, say, early October, but when you get to cooler environments, that might be later. I collected in early October this year from southern Minnesota. That was, again, not the greatest time. I was competing with squirrels. I was competing with a weird wet year. So I didn't get too many seeds. So you'll have to play around with where you can get them and how often you can go out. You'll also need to make sure that you're collecting at the correct time. Really only collect fallen nuts. Don't damage the tree by trying to collect from a branch. And you need to make sure that the fruit shows visible seams of cracking. When the seams aren't present, the seeds, or when the seams are not there, the seeds and sides are not ripe to take, and they're not going to be good for you. Again, some precautions to take. Make sure that you disinfect everything before you go ahead and gather. This will limit the spread of any potential disease like chestnut blight. You'll need to make sure that your shoes have been disinfected, that your tools have been disinfected, your gloves have been disinfected. Speaking of which, make sure that you wear thick leather gloves. The fruits are very spiky and they cause some splinters. So having those gloves will just help you in the long term. It'll make the collecting a lot more fun and a lot more enjoyable and a lot less painful. And if you have mobility issues, go ahead and use a reaching tool. You can grab the fruits quickly from the ground just based on one of those grabbers that you get from a hardware store. When you've gotten your seeds, you can go ahead and process them for planting. Again, you're going to want to use your thick leather gloves. Make sure that you're not getting pricked and spiked by these very spiky fruits. You'll want to make sure that you sort your seeds by viability. You can go ahead and discard all the non-viable or unpollinated seeds. These would look like kind of deflated chestnuts. You'll know them when you see them. They're very flat, they're very furry, and they just don't look like they will be good eating. Get rid of those. You can go ahead and toss them. Make sure that you toss them in your garbage. So again, you're limiting any disease spread. You'll want to discard all your burrs and leaves and other plant materials. Again, they might have some spores of chestnut blight on them. Again, make sure that you're not composting them. Make sure that they are going in the garbage so they are removed from anything that might be infected. And speaking of infection, make sure that you disinfect everything while you're working. This includes your work area, it includes your gloves, it includes your storage, it includes everything that these seeds might touch. And speaking of your seeds, you're going to want to soak them in a 10% bleach solution to remove the blight even further. I use just 1 part bleach to 9 parts water, and that seems to have not damaged the seeds while giving me a little bit more of peace of mind. And this again was recognized as an effective solution by the American Chestnut Foundation. Storing your seeds, again, like most of our tree species here in the US, seeds need to be subject to a period of cold weather before they're able to germinate. So you can store them in a wide variety of different things. I stored them in sand this year, as you can see by my picture over there. That was my setup. But you can also store them in wet soil or peat moss or potting mix, really anything that will hold that water and keep things damp. However, you don't want them to be too wet or else that will rot the seeds. So you'll want to make sure that your storage containers have decent airflow. I drilled holes in the sides and bottom of my container. You can do the same thing. You'll want to start your cold storage 2 to 3 months before you're ready to start planting. They need that 2 to 3 month period of cold stratification. I did 3 months this year, but you can probably get 2 months would be just as fine. And then just feel free to experiment and have fun. Try different planting mediums. Try different ways to store. Try different ways to keep them in your fridge. Try different hole placements. You can even try keeping them outside through the winter. As long as they're protected from predators, see how that goes. This year, I did the standard seeds and sand and planting them in my fridge for 2 to 3 months before they're ready for actual planting. Starting seeds, you can start really whenever you want, as long as that 2 to 3 month period of stratification has taken place, and as long as you have places to put them. So for my setup this year, I had about 50 seeds that I went and cold stratified. Don't be alarmed if you'll see some root growth. That's a good sign that shows that your seeds, again, are viable, and that shows that they are ready to go. So when I took these out after 3 months, several of them did have some root growth. The only thing you'll need to keep an eye on is the direction which you plant your seeds. You'll want that root to be pointing downward. That's not a stem. That's its way to get as deep into the soil as possible. You'll also want to use a very deep pot. I used, as you can see here, 10-inch deep pots. I got them from a greenhouse website. They are the best thing to do to keep roots from not getting root bound and to keep them from being too short or from dwarfing themselves. So you're going to want that deep root growth. And eventually, after about 2 to 3 weeks, you'll start seeing seedlings pop up. My setup this year, I had 50 seeds. I already have growth of about 45 of them. So pretty good results just based on putting seeds in a fridge. And finally, you'll want to know where to plant. Know your site conditions. You can get a good idea of what your soil looks like based on the web soil survey that you can find online, whether you get soil testing materials from a hardware store. There are a lot of varieties that you can do. But again, you're going to want to know that your soil is upland, acidic, and well-drained. It also needs full to partial sunlight. Again, these trees love forest edges. So you want to keep a similar habitat where you're going to be planting your trees. Don't put it in full shade. That's not going to give you any good results. You're also going to want to protect your seedlings. You're going to want to protect them mainly from deer. The deer, again, love chestnut seedlings. It's one of their favorite foods. You'll want to use either tree tubes or cages, enough to make sure a deer can't stick their head down in there and start eating your leaves. You're going to want to plant multiple if you want a solid crop of chestnuts. You'll want them to share that pollen and make sure that there's more germination or more pollination. And you'll want to get permission to plant. So make sure that if you are not planting on your own property, make sure you have permission to plant on anyone else's property. Just going off of all of these recommendations, on the right-hand side, you can see a tree growing out in the wild in its preferred conditions. This is a acidic site. It's well drained. You can see that it was chomped on by a deer, so it has multiple stems now. But from the leaves, we can tell they're nice and green. They're nice and happy. They're growing very well. This is a good spot. On the right-hand side, this is a tree that was planted in a park. This one is not doing that great. You can see that the leaves are very yellow. You'll notice that it will turn this way when it's under stress, mainly from soil conditions. So if your seedlings are turning yellow, that's a good sign that it needs some adjustment in the soil around it. You might need to give it more sand. You might not need to make the soil a little more acidic. You might need to make sure it's more well drained, but that's a good idea to show that your tree is under stress. But that's really all I have for the American chestnut. That was a lot of information. It was a culmination of about 8 months of research over this past year. So I will open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to let me know right now, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can.
Great presentation, David. Thank you. We have about 9 questions, so we'll jump right into them. Well, 10. Carol says she visited a farm near Tempelua, Wisconsin in the 80s, a huge chestnut tree. Do you know whether they were utilized for any restoration or breeding project?
So there are a couple of really big populations in Wisconsin, and I think their story, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone else on the chat, but I believe their story is very similar to ours. It was mainly due to Eastern settlers bringing them in and planting them just on their own homesteads. There's a very famous chestnut stand near West Salem, Wisconsin. It's, I believe, still the largest chestnut stand still in existence. That started, if I remember correctly, from 9 trees, and it's well into the hundreds at this point. So it really was not a big effort, I don't think, in Wisconsin, unless they had someone similar to Richard Dorer who planted them. It was mostly remnants from those early days of people planting on their own homesteads.
Okay. I lost my questions for a second here. Can you comment on, are there other hosts for chestnut blight, and are other tree species tolerant and infectious, but not killed?
Yes. So if we're thinking relatives of chestnuts, Japanese and Chinese chestnuts and other Asian species are fairly resilient to chestnut blight. That's where chestnut blight evolved in and around those species. So those two are pretty well adapted. That being said, there are organizations trying breeding programs to bring in some of those genetics and making hybrids. They're trying to keep the American chestnut characteristics while also having that resistance. But those would be the most resilient out of the chestnut relatives. Other species that can host chestnut blight include, if we're just thinking about Minnesota, the white oak is really our biggest one. And again, the white oak is present throughout the state, so that's a pretty big challenge with planting. We'll want to make sure that if we do plant chestnut, they're not too close to white oak. But we have other species of oaks that are more eastern and more southern, like scarlet oak and live oak. And then we have other just strange host plants that have seen chestnut blight develop on them, but aren't considered major hosts. Things like staghorn sumac, some species of maple, shagbark hickory. There's a lot, but the white oak is a really biggest one that isn't another chestnut species.
Very good. So if you can shut down your presentation, the audience gets a larger view of you answering their questions.
Yeah, let me go ahead and stop my presentation.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Are seeds available? William wants to know if seeds are available to the public. I may be interested in planting some on my farm near northern Clearwater County.
Seeds are available, but you will really have to do your due diligence. There are commercial growers, but a lot of complaints have been noted that some of them might be hybrids with other species. Some of them might not be pure American chestnut, but second or third generation hybrids, and some of them might be contaminated. So you'll really have to do your due diligence. My biggest recommendation is reaching out to the American Chestnut Foundation. They should know who is a reputable source of American chestnuts. And if you're a member of their organization, you'll be able to purchase wild type American chestnuts directly from them. And they'll make sure that they are blight free. They'll make sure that they are wild type. They don't have any hybridization with other species. But it's kind of a mixed bag. I got very lucky. I got to harvest from the wild this year. So that's always my recommendation. But again, you'll have to follow those site rules. But I would encourage reaching out to the American Chestnut Foundation.
Okay. So we got about 9 minutes left and lots of questions.
Yep.
Is American chestnut a potential tree for assisted migration in northern Minnesota? If so, which seed source should be used and or are available?
That is a really good question. I haven't heard of any concerted effort to do assisted migration of American chestnuts into northern Minnesota. However, there are example plantings near Cloquet and near Grand Rapids. So they are there. And they struggle a little bit in the winter, but that struggling is okay. And they've been flowering and producing burrs. So the opportunity is there. My seed source that I would recommend is searching for them in southern Minnesota. I think that would be the best opportunity. They're already well adapted to Minnesota winters down south. So assisting them moving up north is a smaller step. Additionally, what I would recommend is, again, reaching out to the American Chestnut Foundation. They might give you a good idea of where else to get them if you're interested. And then just keeping your eye out on the landscape, seeing if you can find them out in the wild, or seeing if you can get in contact with other growers who have successfully grown them near your neck of the woods. There might be someone who just does it as a hobby, and they might have seeds to share for you.
Okay. Brad wants, apologies if I missed this as I arrived late. Are there negative correlations to the Chinese chestnut?
The Chinese chestnut is a very different tree. It doesn't have the same growth pattern, it doesn't have the same habitat, and it doesn't have the same benefits that an American chestnut would. If you're thinking of growing it wild, if you're just growing for nut production, they are, again, not terribly adapted to Minnesota winters unless you get down south. But again, it's sort of a trial and error situation. When you do buy them, if you do make sure that you get Chinese chestnut, you're going to want to make sure that they are blight free, just in case you're near an American chestnut stand and you're limiting disease spread. They are commercially available, but in Minnesota, they're not a very popular species to put on your landscape. Again, there are hybrids between American and Chinese chestnuts that are a little more adapted, but it's, again, trial and error at this point.
Okay. Teresa wants to know, how old does a tree need to be before it starts to produce a nut crop?
That's a good question. There are differing estimates. I think it's between 8 and 10 years old, which is when they start. But I've also heard people say up to 15 years old. That being said, something that I didn't get to in my presentation is that chestnut blight will infect the tree or will start attacking the tree at the same amount of time.
Okay.
So it's again, we're trying to get chestnuts producing before the blight hits. So knowing where to plant them and knowing how to hold off that chestnut blight is good to get hammered down before your tree starts producing in that 8 to 10 year range.
Good deal. Julia says, are there blight resistant variants that were tested and available to homeowners for planting?
There are. Again, the American Chestnut Foundation is doing the majority of the work with those hybrids and back crossings of those American chestnuts. So what they have now is a tree that's 80 to 90% American and about 10% Chinese or Japanese or other Asian species. They typically don't ship them out, so it's harder to get those on your landscape. There are what are known as Dunstan chestnuts, which are more of that first generation hybrid between American and Chinese. On top of that, there are some American chestnuts that do show a better resistance to blight. It's hard to pinpoint if that's hereditary or if we can breed for it, but some Americans do have it. Some will either produce seeds and then get the blight, or some will just survive in perpetuity and be able to hold off that blight. It's really, again, trial and error, planting as many as we can to see what we can find.
Good answer. Carol's got a question here. A friend gave us 2 hybrids last year. Should we be worried about messing with the gene pool?
That's a larger question. As long as you're not near an American chestnut stand, that should be okay to plant. I mean, pollen can only travel so long. It's hard when you get into the mile range. Your pollen isn't going to be transferring that long. So as long as you're several miles away from an American chestnut stand, that's okay. It's when you start introducing those hybrids in areas where we know pure American chestnut is, that's where we're getting those hybrid seeds, and that's where we might see some deviation from what a pure American chestnut has been adapted to or what it should look like. So it's knowing where to plant. That's the biggest thing.
Okay. Matt wants to know, will a neutral pH of 7.0 to 7.2 be suitable for the American chestnut?
That's its higher range. So when I read about this, it's usually a pH between about 5.5 to 7 is the range that you're going to be looking for. Anything more than 7, you might be struggling. But again, trial and error. If it works, then it works. It's always worth trying if you have the resources to do it, and just noting what it looks like at the end of the day. There are places that it doesn't. There are places that it grows that just isn't its ideal habitat, but it will grow just fine. So again, try it out, see if it works.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes here and a lot of questions.
Mhm.
So we asked our host if he would be interested in answering these in an email format, and I think he agreed to that. So if we don't get through them all, Peggy wants to know where the hedgerow is in Rochester, but I don't know if you feel comfortable in sharing that. And why is the hedgerow a bad idea?
So the hedgerow in itself wasn't a bad idea. That's just where we first noticed chestnut blight. That's where we first, that's where the DNR at least was first able to pinpoint it. The hedgerow wasn't a bad idea. Again, it was one of those old plantings that settlers brought in before we even knew what chestnut blight was. So it was just a victim of circumstance. It was just sort of ground zero here in Minnesota of where blight came from. I don't believe it still exists. I think they all died. There are plantings in and around Rochester, again, just based on individuals wanting to plant them. But that instance in particular, it wasn't a good thing or a bad thing. It just was where we first saw where disease came from. So I don't believe they're still there. I think they, since that's where blight first showed up, I think they're all gone, unfortunately.
Okay, so we've reached the end of our allotted time. I'm so sorry. Next week's show has been canceled due to a family medical emergency, and we will not be able to host a show. So tune in next time for episode 201. And I know Cassie just sent me a message on that, but you think I can find it quickly? No. So anyway, we're going to take a week off. We'll be back with episode 201. Thank you, Cassie. If you hope, she just reading the landscape. See how good she is? So you can tune in for that one. We'll have Cassie take us back to the green room, and we'll continue a little conversation there, David.
Yep,
All right,
sounds good.
hang on.